Thank you very much, and thanks for being here this morning. And it's a great topic because it affects all of us. And as you've heard, that we all serve on Energy and Commerce, and one of the things I like to say about this is that one of the great things about it is that we actually look over the horizon 5 to 10 years, because we're talking to the entrepreneurs and innovators out there in the field. And so it's up to us to make sure that any legislation that's passed is not interfering on that innovation. And a little bit about on the internet things with me is that in the last Congress, Peter Welch and I, we had a bipartisan working group, and we looked at multiple issues. And the issues, we looked at from healthcare to manufacturing to autos to agriculture. We looked across the spectrum of how things could change. We heard how many devices. It was kind of interesting. One of the things I remember several years ago in committee, somebody was then talking about how many interconnected devices we have across the globe by the end of last year. And the number was 1.6 per person. And it's just like, we've blown by that. We have, if you go out and look where we are today, with the interconnected devices that we have today, you're in the billions, and you've heard that number. We're looking at by 2025 where it's going to be. So it's important that, when we were doing the internet thing, working group, we heard from folks from the West Coast, Silicon Valley, to the East Coast, to the Midwest. Everyone said the same thing. When we're working on these, the big part is that we got to make sure that if there's regulations out there, everyone agreed to one thing, that we have soft touch regulations, so they can be out there innovating. Because if you all of a sudden you have the federal government coming in and saying, what we're going to tell you that you're going to have, that's not going to work. The other issue is the amount of spectrum we're going to have. With 5G coming on, that's another issue. So we look at a lot of different issues in the working group because we want to make sure we went forward with new legislation and then the regulations that come from that. And we're out there making sure that the United States is always in the lead. And when you look at being in the lead out there, it's just like I offered the Self-Drive Act this Congress. And we're looking at real bad statistics out there. We had traffic deaths are going up in this country. We had 37,000 last year. We had 6 million traffic accidents, 2 million with the people being injured. But at the same time, we had 94% of the accidents were caused by driver error. And so by incorporating and starting into with self-drive, we're going to do a lot of different things. Because we had to look at things with safety, cybersecurity, privacy. We want to make sure that when folks are out there, and a lot of these segments, like my mom, she gave up her driver's license when I turned 16 because of her vision problem. So folks out there that aren't able to get themselves around, they'll have transportation, senior citizens. So there's a whole raft of things out there that can happen because of the Internet of Things, but it's coming, and it's things that we've been incorporating. But when you look at the devices that are all working together, again, we're going to have a lot more spectrum out there to make sure this all works. So the committee's looking at it, the working group had looked at it, and so we want to go forward. When you talked about driving to work this morning, Columbus, Ohio was awarded the first smart city. So when you incorporate all these different types of devices all together, so you'll have streetlights working with you together. How many cars are on the street? Should the lights for the at night be on certain spots? They'll all be interconnected because of the Internet of Things. So it's really a wonderful area that we're in. And as Jim was talking about, I'm sure I didn't understand all that stuff about that computer either. but where we are today is that we have that technology, but we want the United States to be the lead. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. Thank you.
Good morning to you all, and it's my pleasure to be with you and to the Ripon Society. Thank you for inviting me, Jim. It's a pleasure to serve on Bob's subcommittee, and he does a terrific job, and he has pointed out why we have to move in the direction where we are moving. I point out on the increase in traffic accidents. That's probably due to the fact that people are now engaged in the internet while they're driving and doing so inappropriately. And so with each advance comes a step perhaps in the other direction. And I would imagine that driverless automobiles may to some extent mitigate against the relatively dramatic increase we've seen in traffic accidents. And obviously we need to make sure that that occurs. I'm also on Marcia's subcommittee on telecom. I have the honor of being the vice chair there. And as you know, Marcia will be leaving the House to go to the Senate. I make that prediction today. I do so because I think it's true, number one, and number two, I'm her vice chair. In that order, ladies and gentlemen. And we're obviously involved in all sorts of issues. I'm the sponsor of the Airwaves Act, and I want to give credit to Cory Gardner and the new senator from New Hampshire, Senator Hassan, whom I don't really know. They're working on that diligently in the other side of the Capitol, and Mr. Doyle, the ranker, and I are working on that on our side. It's incredibly important, 5G. It's also incredibly important for rural America, and that is an underserved area. The district I have the honor of serving is suburban and completely wired, or wired 99.49%, whatever the purity of ivory soap. But this is a challenge in rural America, and Airwaves is designed, at least in part, to make sure that that challenge is successfully overcome. The full committee is a joy because, as this distinguished group knows, more legislation reaches the floor of the House from our committee than any other committee. More legislation goes over to the Senate, and more legislation reaches the desk of the President of the United States, whoever the President of the United States is, from the Energy and Commerce Committee. I hope moving forward that we continue in the bipartisan tradition. There are debates as to how policy should be achieved. Chairman Pai was in my office yesterday. We obviously believe in a light touch on these issues, and that is not necessarily the view of the other side of the aisle. And if the other side of the aisle were to gain control of either House of the Federal Congress, I place it in the subjunctive voice because I think we will be successful. But if the other side were to gain control, I think there would be much heavier regulation in all of these areas. I do not think that that is desirable. We have been the leader across the globe because of the light touch, and I want to make sure that that continues. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Jim and the rest of the staff at Ripon for inviting me this morning. I think most of you know, before I was in Congress, I was a healthcare provider, so the Internet of Things is an exciting area for healthcare also. I think though the thing I'm most excited about is if I'm running low on milk, you know, and my wife has told me to stop and pick some up, it's probably already been ordered by my refrigerator and delivered to my house. And that's not a crazy idea, by the way. This is what the Internet of Things will be doing for all of us. But in healthcare, particularly, you know, making it, getting medical records more portable and patients being able to carry their own information or transferring their own information and data is really important. Integrating medical devices and other healthcare monitoring devices. Even I have a Fitbit on, but there's a dramatic expansion of what we can monitor, including for diabetic monitoring and output, how much your heart is putting out, blood is pumping, and that your doctor can manage literally on a moment-to-moment basis. And these are all things that could potentially be interconnected in the healthcare space. For example, already we have, say a neonate will have a wristband on that that if someone tries to take that person out of the hospital unexpectedly, it communicates immediately back to the medical people that will prevent that. So there's just a multitude of things that I'm excited about on the Internet of Things as it relates to healthcare. And I think we're really on the tip of the iceberg here. But I do think, and I agree with both of my colleagues, that whatever we do, we want to make sure that we don't stymie innovation, that we don't hold entrepreneurs back from developing things, and for me in the healthcare space, that could make people's lives better, make their quality of life better. And we're at risk for that if we're not aggressive, and we need input from industry. We need input from all of you about what is appropriate, what is helpful, what are the guidelines that you need, like on the self-driving car. They came to us, right, Bob, and said, hey, we need some guidelines here so that we can we know where things are going to be, and all of a sudden we get so far down the line in an area that we're developing, and all of a sudden the federal government comes in and says, by the way, we don't like that, and you can't do that, and it sets people back. So for me, again, it's about the healthcare space and ideas to advance our health and well-being, and also help us control cost. Technology can actually, I think, help us control cost in the healthcare space. If we can identify problems that people are having earlier and address them more quickly, and in the long run save us money. So, thanks for inviting me.
So one of the things that I know I always hear our executives talk about is the danger about IoT, that if we don't fix the cyber issue, then we won't have the adoption that all the technologists out there see as the promise, so that technology can really help all of us make our lives better. How do you all see cyber playing here? Dr. Bucshon?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I mean, there's already been, I think, on Homeland, an episode from the medical standpoint where someone's pacemaker was hacked into, turned off, and that person was expired
Yes.
because it was an attack on Homeland. I don't know if anybody watches Homeland, but it's good.
Yes. It wasn't the vice president now, was it?
I don't know. My point is, I'm trying to make is, your point is very well taken, and I'll just speak to the medical space. There are real concerns about cybersecurity and about personal data and things like who can interact with medical devices, even Fitbits, who can assess your health or what you're doing in your life, and then make judgments based on that, either whether or not you're at higher insurance risk, and so it makes you uninsurable because people get data on you that you don't want them to have. It's a real issue. I think people are trying to address it, and I think Chairman Latta will probably have quite a bit more to say about that.
Well, cyber is everywhere. When you're talking about, I served on 2 cybersecurity task force, and we've also, in my district, we've done 7 cyber events with the FBI. And usually when I kick them off before the FBI takes over, I tell everybody, okay, I'm going to sound like I'm paranoid. I said, by the time these guys get done with it, you're all going to be paranoid. And usually everybody is. They get very, very nervous about things. But again, it's just like when we were looking at the Self-Drive Act, cyber is a huge part of that. You can't have cars being controlled by someone else driving off the road and things like that. You have to have redundancy built in. I mean, redundancy on top of redundancy on redundancy on the cyber side. So as the doctor mentioned, that it's very important on the healthcare side, but I mean, it's everywhere. It's, as I mentioned, from manufacturing, because again, I have 60,000 manufacturing jobs in my district. I represent the largest farm income producing district in the state. And so when you're looking at, from everything from being able to use IoT to help in the manufacturing process, you got to make sure that they're not hacked. You look on the financial side, you want people out there to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to do more of my banking online, do more of my banking from my phone. But you're not going to do that if you don't think you have security out there. So usually every place I go when I'm talking with folks, I always like to ask them right off the bat is, what are you doing on your cyber side? What are you doing to make sure you're protected? Because one of the things that we've also have seen is you have a lot of people in the chain say, you know what, I'm so low on this, nobody's going to hack into us or attack us because we're too low. And I said, I hate to tell you this, you've probably already been hacked. Because the whole idea is to find the weakest link to get in so you go up the chain. So cyber is probably the big issue that we talk about all the time. And so to make sure that we can get done what we want to do, that's the topic.
It's incredibly important in the sectors that are represented here this morning. But I don't think that the focus in the discussion nationally, or at least with the public, has been here. It's been rather in the national security field and in the election field. I point out that the new Secretary of State, a friend of ours, Mark Pompeo, was on the Energy and Commerce Committee when he was in the House of Representatives. And in the biographies that I've seen this week, his tenure for more than a year at the CIA has been highlighted. But from my perspective, first and foremost, he is a veteran of our committee. And so I think this is very good for cyber protection across the board, including those avenues we're discussing here this morning. I believe that he will be a very strong voice with the President on cyber across the board, because we've heard him testify on Capitol Hill on his considered views with which I agree, that there are major international challenges, and I hope that the President will heed the very competent and strong advice of his new Secretary of State.
Thank you.
I just want to add, I think it's important for the private sector to interact with in an ongoing way with the federal government as it relates to this issue and how we, from a national security standpoint, as Leonard pointed out, so that we can voluntarily help each other with these risks. You see that in the Equifax situation, where the federal government actually gave them a heads up on a security risk, and unfortunately it wasn't acted on fast enough. But I mean, that interaction, I just want to say, is going to be also very important if we're all going to protect all of our companies and us as individuals.
Okay, thank you for that point. That was a wonderful answer to my question, and we would agree. I think one of the things you're hearing industry say is you want to bake in security so that you're seeing it at all levels, whether you're the highest person on the totem pole or the lowest, that connection back to the internet. So thank you for your perspective. I have one more question before opening it up. I love the fact that you mentioned, Columbus is a leader in smart cities. There was a big competition and the city of Columbus won on smart city infrastructure. Obviously that rural bandwidth is not an issue in cities like Columbus, but it is an issue. And we have, the last statistic I heard was 10% of the US, doesn't have wireless and doesn't have that connection. How can we ensure that rural communities benefit from IoT development as well?
By passing my bill, the airway bill, ladies and gentlemen. 10% of proceeds of the auctions required to deploy wireless in underserved areas. And the act requires the FCC to study the impact of unlicensed spectrum on rural healthcare, education, agriculture, and broadband access. And that comes from a sponsor from the most densely populated state in the Union, New Jersey.
Well, it's a good question, because also in the House we also have the rural caucus that we have in the Energy.
I'm not a member of that club.
But wait, we'll make it honorary.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, you're always welcome. But we also have a House Senate working group that we have with both members from Republicans, Democrats, House, Senate. But it's very important, because across the state of Ohio, there's a lot of areas that we don't have it. If you don't have internet, if you don't have the capability of having service out there, it affects not only on the farming side, but also for people that want to have a business out there. So you see people say, you know what, I can't have my business where I want it. I'm going to have to move someplace else, because we have a lot of areas just that are just not underserved. We have unserved areas, and those are the areas that we really have to look at, is getting out and talk with. And I think that the Chairman Pye, from where he comes from in Kansas, understands what unserved areas are. And you can't have these dead areas out there and expect, I was told the other day about some kids up in North Dakota that actually go to McDonald's in Canada because they can't get wireless at home, so they're actually crossing the border to do their homework. You shouldn't have to do that. So we want to make sure we get. And I just met this week again with the FCC talking about, we've got to get this developed out into the areas that don't have it, because if we want to see everybody succeed, this is how it's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about, it's about money. I mean, ultimately, I kind of see the internet and rural broadband. I represent a very rural area of Indiana, and I agree with all the comments my colleagues have made. At the end of the day, I see it almost as getting electricity to the farm 100 years ago, getting the telephone out to the farm and all the communities, whenever that was, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. At the end of the day, you know, from a business perspective, if you look at the cost of getting rural broadband in any significant way, the last mile or two from wherever the loop of connectivity is, that's where a lot of the expense is. And so I think we need to work with the private sector, but we're going to have to find, I think personally, and this may not be popular amongst Republicans, but we're going to have to find federal resources to help make that happen. I just don't see it as a way. It's like the telephone and electricity. You have to have it. You had to have those when they came in. You have to have connectivity. You know, I have a business right now in my district that's considering moving their headquarters out of Posey County, Indiana, down to Florida, because they don't have the connectivity they need to expand their business in southern Indiana. So.
Thank you. With that, does the audience have any questions that they'd like to ask our distinguished panel this morning? Yes?
Can you talk a little more about 5G and spectrum? Because every time I hear the word spectrum, I think somebody's going to get a haircut. It's got to be a challenge.
It is a challenge, and the question is how to balance the equities. And I agree with Larry that ultimately, as is true with most issues that cross my desk, it's a matter of funding, and we try to strike the right balance. I don't want to be overly partisan, but I do have concerns that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle would strike a different balance, and I do not think that would lead to wiring the whole country, and I think it would stifle, at least to some extent, innovation.
And again, with the working groups that we have in the House and also with our colleagues over in the Senate, it's really finding what works best in certain areas. And so it's just like going back, some people in this room are not going to remember this, and my wife says, sometimes you're going to date yourself. But, we don't want the federal government out there determining what's best, because sometimes it's best for out in the community to figure that out. Go back, was it going to be VHS or Beta? Was it going to be 8-track or cassette? But we want to make sure
that was in the
that's before you were born.
I thought you were younger than I, Bob.
I remember I read it in a history book. But it's important that because we're looking at 5G and the deployment that we're looking at and how it's going to transform things out there. We have got to make sure we do it right. We got to make sure, again, when we talk to all these groups and all these individuals that came before us in the IoT working groups, and 5G came up. And again, it comes back to we've got to have soft touch regulation, soft touch legislation, and make sure that they can go out there and get this thing innovated, get it out there and to the public. Because again, when you're looking at what it's going to do for self-drive and everything else, it's it's going to be a huge part of the future that we have to have it. So. Spectrum, it's one of those things that we've been told through time that different, bands out there that, can't get any more out of it. Well, again, they're figuring out ways to squeeze it more and more and more to get more. We asked with the military if they could look and find, if you're only using a band maybe 1 week of the year, what can we get from them? At first they didn't do anything, but then they came back and said, yeah, we think we can do something. So it's like we've got to find everything we can out there, because again, we've seen the auctions, the huge auctions about getting more spectrum out there to be used, because again, it's the future. We got to have it.
Okay, thank you. Next question from the audience.
It can't be that early.
There you go.
There we go.
Okay, over in the corner.
Okay. Your self-drive act passed with just a huge majorities, right, in both parties, but a similar bill in the Senate is bottled up in Senator Finn's committee. I'm just wondering, what do you see happening there and the attitudes of the members over there as opposed to in the House with regard to autonomous vehicles?
When we worked on the legislation, I'm really proud of it. We passed out in committee 54-0. And it was amazing that we passed it with a voice vote on the floor, which is, something like I don't think I might ever see again in my life, something that technical. But I think what it really came down to on the House side, we reached across the aisle and we worked with the Democrats. We worked with industry, we worked with all the interested parties that came in. I mean, that's why we had 300 meetings on that bill. I mean, staff, I think, was pretty much had it by the time that bill passed. But it's important. I think that we did it right. We got it done. But again, we listened. We listened to industry. We listened to everyone out there. And with Senator Thune, they with committee work that they've done over there, but it's getting it moving again over in the Senate. But if they don't get this done and we don't get this passed, this is the problem. You can't have 50 states in the District of Columbia saying what those cars are going to do. Because you can't have a car shut itself off before it crosses the bridge. And it will. It'll pull itself off because I can't go over there. So, the legislation said pretty much what we've always said here. We have bumper to bumper on the federal side. States can do all the other things that they're doing right now, but we've got to have that preemption out there to make sure that we can move forward. And again, we shouldn't be afraid of the technology, and I think some people self-driving scared. First of all, those cars right now, you're not going to go out and buy one. They're going to be fleet-type vehicles. We have to get them out so they can be tested, and that's a big part of it. But the other part of it is that a lot of people don't realize that they've got a lot of levels in their car right now. If you think about going back to the issue of having cruise control in a car, then cars can back themselves into parking. And I've watched some people around this town that need that. Be able to parallel park a car. But then you have cars that have self-brake. Make sure that there's something in the roadway to brake. Also stay within the lanes. So you're always starting to see cars going up in these levels. People don't even realize technology is being built in. But as we go up even farther, we just can't have those 50 states. And they're already out there starting to legislate. And if we don't, the United States is going to fall behind the rest of the world. And we want the technology developed here because we're the innovators.
I'd just like to follow up on that point. I heard from our trade association that represents the 60 biggest tech companies in the U.S. that there are 44 different working groups in government that are focused on IoT. And I will tell you from an industry perspective, trying to keep up and influence and make sure that they're doing the right thing is exhausting, but also hugely duplicative. I'm going to put Congressman Lance on the hot seat for a second. I know you've tried to address this a little bit. Could you talk a little bit about HR 195 and what you're trying to do there and sort of the intent behind that?
The intent is to make the public aware of how we have to move forward, and I certainly think that we need a greater awareness. Might I address your question just briefly? It is my observation, being here 10 years, that the Senate operates almost completely differently from the House.
A slight understatement.
I have publicly stated that I am opposed to the filibuster, which I suppose is easy for me to say because I'm not in the Senate. I don't think necessarily this issue is related to getting 60 votes, but I think that is in the miasma on all issues, number one. Number two, on your point, there are 44 groups, you say? There is a new governor in New Jersey. We had a governor's race as well as Virginia. I know everybody in the room talks about Virginia. New Jersey had a governor's race as well. And our new governor and a newly elected legislature, overwhelmingly Democratic, is about to consider legislation, which I believe will pass, trying to place in statutory law at the state level in New Jersey, Tom Wheeler's net neutrality. It's unconstitutional, in my legal judgment. But this is the type of thing that occurs across the board. And it's going to become more complicated and more difficult. And on the driverless car issue, we obviously need a nationwide standard so that there aren't different standards in the various jurisdictions, and I think this is a significant challenge, and I sadly predict that my home state on the issue of net neutrality is going to pass legislation probably by June 30th.
I also know that Maryland was looking at doing something very similar, and we think industry has talked them out of it, but who knows?
I doubt that industry will be able to talk the new governor of New Jersey and our overwhelmingly democratically controlled state legislature out of it. I obviously am a voice on the other side, but I think they're marching in that direction to make a political statement as if we don't favor all of us together a free and open internet. But this has been so confused through terms of art like net neutrality.
Well, that brings up a great question. You know, you mentioned that, bills have passed out of E&C on a very bipartisan basis with all the debate around net neutrality and some of the privacy issues. How do we make sure that IoT doesn't get caught up in that sort of quagmire and stays bipartisan?
Well, again, I think it's starting with when we did the work back in the 114th Congress. I think that it was very, I shouldn't say, I believe that by having members come in to sit in for those meetings and to ask questions for all the different groups that we had come before us, people really came, to a conclusion that members that were there saw that we got to make sure that we don't do a heavy, over-regulated type of internet out there, or the Internet of Things, because I shouldn't say, back, I shouldn't say internet, but we're getting into the net neutrality, but it's on the Internet of Things. But it's important that we understand that the innovation that's occurring out there, that's so important that we move forward, that all the things that it's touching today, and it's moving so quickly, it's like, how can you set a federal standard and we don't know what it's going to look like? And again, that's, it's kind of tongue in cheek. I was talking about how things, between cassette and 8-tracks, things like that. But it was the people out there that decided what they wanted. And it's also, we should not, because how can the federal government, again, that's the great thing about being on this committee, looking 5 to 10 years over that horizon, how can we know exactly what it's going to look like? We're not the ones that are developing this. So it's really up to the industry out there to bring forth those, and again, it's like with driverless cars. We don't want to pick the winners and losers with who's going to be the one, but we want the best to come to the top, and that's what we want to have happen here. We want the best to come to the top, and it's not going to be by heavy-handed federal regulation and legislation that's going to do it. We're talking about the Internet of Things.
Great. Thank you. And I think Jim has our final question this morning.
Gentlemen, with all the hearings and demonstrations that you've seen in the past few years, looking forward to the next 5 or 10 years, what do you believe will be the most interesting and fascinating innovation that will come out that you've seen or have been that you've talked about to different distributors throughout the U.S.? We'd be very curious to know this.
I'll focus on healthcare. I think the ability of us to assess people's ongoing well-being, whether that's your blood sugar level if you're a diabetic, whether that's your heart rate if you have an arrhythmia problem, and whether that's how much blood your heart's putting out if you have congestive heart failure, and have that monitored on a more consistent basis where physicians and other healthcare providers can interact and get ahead of impending healthcare crises that might make you end up in the hospital, which costs a lot of money. I see in the healthcare space just an infinite opportunity for us to innovate and advance and make people's lives better.
What about the chips being put on medication so that you could monitor either your kids or your parents, or just looking at the whole opioid situation in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's gets into other privacy issues and that it's specific. People have talked about, for example, Alzheimer's patients where you can monitor their location and things like that. But that's a bigger discussion. I think that you have to have on the privacy side, and that's more complicated. But if there are ways that we can monitor people's compliance with their medical therapy in a non-privacy violating way, that would be important, because anybody in healthcare knows about half the people don't take their medicines the way it's prescribed. My father-in-law takes his diuretic, his water pill, when he feels like his blood pressure's high. But and when he doesn't take it when he doesn't think it's high because it makes him go to the bathroom all the time. That's a big example. If you could, if you can interact more in a way where you could monitor that type of behavior, and that way when he comes to the hospital, well, how come their blood pressure's really high? Well, they didn't take their medicine, even though most patients say that they did. So, but when you get into monitoring people's, location and other behavior, that's dicier, I think.
I think we go back to driverless cars. And, I can think about this topic a long time ago. My dad was first elected to Congress in 1958, served through 88. And this is back in the days when we'd start school, my sister and I back home, and dad would find us a place to live for 5 months down here. And then we'd pound the pavement maybe twice a month, driving back to Ohio on the weekends. I can remember as a kid on the Pennsylvania Ohio Turnpike when I was 5 or 6 years of age, thinking to myself, it'd be great if dad could just fall asleep in the car. We get to the east gate of Ohio, you just wake up, pay the toll, we get on the Pennsylvania, drive 161 miles per hour. I got these things down. 161, and then get off, and then we had to do that before there were any interstate roads. You have to drive through the mountains to get down to DC then, and I thought, wouldn't that be incredible? Well, we're at that stage today. But when you're talking about issues about drugs and opioids, when you think about, again, that when you look at 94% of the accidents that occur on the road today are because of driver error. More people are dying now because of opioid and drugs than they are of drunk driving. So all of a sudden, if you can take that off the table, and that 37,000 people that are dying every year, and reduce that dramatically, and then you think about all of the accidents that would be averted, you think about the energy that would be saved because people, there's stop, start. It's not, vehicles would be flowing all together. I even thought back, I was ahead of my time back then. I thought about this as a kid. Dad, we get on something and we go 70 miles an hour across the turnpike, nobody'd be blocking the way, so you just go get across it. But we're there today. And, I've driven in 2 driverless cars. The one was like on a figure 8. The other one was on 395. Now that was more of a change. I got in the passenger seat up front, and there was a brake on there, and I thought to myself, I wish I had that brake when I taught my kids how to drive. But we got out there, and I said, now what happens when we get across the bridge and you put it in auto mode, and when cars are running emergencies, we'll just watch. So we're driving along, we're driving 50 plus, and sure enough, the car's coming down the ramp. There's a car in the lane next to us, so we couldn't get over, so the car just slowed down and let that car in. Next ramp we came up to, there was not a car on the other way, so it could move over. So traffic would keep moving. So when you think about all of the things that this can do, and you're talking about a $950 billion industry in the United States today, and the tens of thousands of jobs, but I look at it on the safety side and on the accident prevention side, what we can do, and it's going to tie into everything then. So I have to say with driverless vehicles.
Thank you. My answer is I don't know. And this has been true for innovation over the last quarter of a century. Who would have thought 25 years ago we are where we are now? I have no idea where we will be 10 years from now, let alone 25 years from now. I think healthcare is important. My own view is that higher education will be revolutionized by this, given the tremendously expensive cost of higher education. I don't think that is at the forefront of the discussion at the moment, but I think it's likely to become so. But my real answer to you, Jim, is that I do not know because of the innovative mind of the American people, the genius of the American people, but I am confident that it is our responsibility, working together with distinguished business leaders in this room, to make sure that the United States is at the forefront of all of this. Thank you for having me, ladies and gentlemen.
Gentlemen, thank you all so much for being with us.